Hey everyone, welcome to today's Explainer. We're diving right into a massive, honestly kind of seismic shift happening on the global stage right now, a real transition away from American military reliance. For decades, the geopolitical world order has been anchored by one massive, seemingly immovable force, and that's the defense guarantees of the United States. But as we're going to see today, the ground is shifting. Allies are waking up to a totally new reality, realizing that the old frameworks just might not hold the same weight they used to.
So it all really boils down to one huge question. What actually happens when the world's undisputed superpower decides to take a step back? When a global hegemon decides its priorities lie elsewhere or that the price of policing the world is simply too high, how do allied nations respond? Do they freeze or do they adapt? Well, we are currently witnessing the real-time answers to these exact questions.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. First, the defense umbrella. Second, shifts in U.S. policy. Third, the impact on allies. And finally, strategic independence.
All right, Section 1. The defense umbrella and those historical U.S. guarantees.
So historically, there's been this framework known as the American defense umbrella. Basically, allied nations could completely outsource their heavy-duty security needs to the U.S. military. Because America was footing the bill for global defense, countries in Europe, for instance, could pour their money into super generous domestic welfare programs. They didn't have to spend massive chunks of their GDP on maintaining huge militaries because, well, the American umbrella was keeping the rain off. But, as recent events have shown us, that reliance comes with a pretty big catch.
15. That is the exact number of missiles Iran fired at the United Arab Emirates. Now, why does that number matter to us? Because it resulted in zero, literally zero, direct U.S. military retaliation. In decades past, an attack on a major partner like the UAE would have almost certainly guaranteed an immediate, overwhelming American response. But here, the U.S. actually opted for restraint. It was a real wake-up call, sending shockwaves through the international community. It flashed a giant neon sign that the old rules of the umbrella were officially changing.
We are living through a massive historical pivot. On one side, we are leaving the era of reliance. That's an era defined by absolute trust in international frameworks, NATO agreements, and the rock-solid guarantee of U.S. intervention. But now, we're rapidly entering the era of autonomy. Because the superpower is hesitating, allies are looking around and realizing they can't just blindly trust the old deals anymore. Instead, there's this sudden, urgent push for sovereign military production and highly localized direct defense pacts.
Moving right along to Section 2, shifts in U.S. policy, specifically regarding avoiding direct conflict.
You know, modern conflicts are increasingly playing out just under the radar of actual all-out war. Look at the Strait of Hormuz. First, the U.S. launches Project Freedom, basically a move to blockade and put economic pressure on Iran. Then, Iran responds, but not by attacking the U.S. directly, which would obviously start a war. Instead, they fire those 15 missiles at the UAE, very carefully calibrating their actions to stay just below that red line. And third, rather than escalating things militarily, the U.S. sticks to economic and diplomatic pressure. They were aiming for a nuclear deal, not a kinetic conflict. The priority in Washington was crystal clear: avoid getting dragged back into a war in the Middle East.
And here's something absolutely crucial to understand. This isn't just a one-sided political phenomenon. The source material outlines a distinctively bipartisan shift happening in Washington. On the Republican side, you've got leaders like Donald Trump expressing heavy skepticism toward NATO funding and showing a real determination to just avoid new military conflicts. But then, looking at the Democratic side, figures from Joe Biden and Kamala Harris to Gavin Newsom are focusing heavily on conditioning military aid. I mean, Biden notably paused certain shipments during conflicts recently. So whether you're looking at potential future leaders like J.D. Vance or current administrations, there's this growing, shared reluctance right across the aisle to engage in or unconditionally bankroll foreign wars.
Just to highlight this, the sources note, and I quote, "Trump clearly doesn't want to go back to war. He is trying to make Iran realize that they have to accept his demands, at least on the nuclear issue. The U.S. is essentially prioritizing economic leverage and broader strategic deals, like the nuclear issue, over the immediate military defense of its partners. And while sure, that strategy is aimed at preventing massive global conflicts, it completely flips the regional dynamics upside down for the allies left on the ground."
Okay, Section 3, the impact on allies. Let's look at these exposed vulnerabilities.
So as that American umbrella folds up, both Europe and Israel are facing some incredibly severe, distinct vulnerabilities. For Europe, their constraints are deeply structural. They're looking at the potential loss of U.S. NATO funding, defense budgets that are super tight because of those generous welfare programs we talked about, and massive demographic challenges. For Israel, though, the constraints are operational. They rely heavily on the U.S. for key munitions, like tank and artillery shells, and they are finding themselves restrained from taking decisive, preemptive military action because the U.S. keeps pushing for regional ceasefires.
Now, diving deeper into Europe's challenges, it's not just a matter of finances. It's a huge manpower problem. The sources point out a severe demographic crisis. Europe is relying on aging populations with birth rates that are just plummeting. Plus, there are major questions regarding the hesitancy of newer immigrant populations to actually serve in traditional national militaries. When you combine that with intense societal resistance to cutting those beloved, long-standing welfare programs just to fund a military draft, you can see why Europe's ability to field traditional forces is fundamentally hindered right now.
Meanwhile, over in the Middle East, Israel is facing its own operational restraints on multiple fronts, specifically in Lebanon and Gaza. Because the U.S. is really prioritizing its own broader diplomatic goals, like securing a nuclear deal with Iran, it actively restrains Israel from fully engaging adversaries like Hezbollah or Hamas. The U.S. pushes hard for ceasefires, and according to the analysts, that actually stalls Israel's military momentum and stops them from decisively disarming those groups. So Israel's security timeline is, in a lot of ways, tied directly to Washington's diplomatic clock.
And that brings us to our final section, Section 4. Strategic independence and the path to autonomy. So the crucial point we are building to is this idea of strategic independence. This is the absolute necessity for a nation to secure its own sovereign military production in a totally unpredictable diplomatic landscape. We actually just saw European leaders convene in Armenia to discuss this exact necessity. It's the stark realization that they literally have to start manufacturing their own weapons and forging their own local pacts, rather than relying entirely on a superpower whose political mood might shift every 4 to 8 years.
And this brilliantly illustrates the real, on-the-ground changes happening today. We are seeing concrete, objective shifts toward domestic military production. Israel and European countries are actively teaming up to build factories in places like Germany, Hungary, Serbia, and Bulgaria. They are directly targeting the exact vulnerabilities we discussed earlier, setting up sovereign production for combat drones, tank shells, and artillery ammo. They are literally building the infrastructure to stand on their own 2 feet.
This massive domestic manufacturing boom is driven by both absolute military necessity and a huge economic horizon. First off, it reduces that dangerous reliance on outsourced military components. Second, it guarantees that these nations are going to have stockpiles absolutely regardless of what happens in future U.S. elections or political shifts. And third, there is a massive economic upside here. With conflicts like the war in Ukraine, the global market is desperately hungry for munitions. By building these factories, these allied nations aren't just securing their own borders, they're capitalizing on a worldwide shortage. Which really leaves us with one final, totally vital question to ponder. Will a world of strategically independent, highly armed, localized militaries be more secure or a whole lot more dangerous? As the American defense umbrella folds up and nations aggressively ramp up their own sovereign production, the global balance of power is permanently changing. We're stepping into a completely new era of self-reliance, and honestly, only time will tell how this decentralized defense landscape is going to reshape our future. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the world around you.